pratiti naš webinar, onda pozdrav i dobrodošli svi na 4. webinar Kro dijaspore i Coka. Prije svega želim se zahvaliti i čestitati svim Hrvatima u Kanadi koji su se kroz posljednjih par dana borili i uspjeli izboriti za svoje pravo glasa. U petak smo saznali o donošenju odluke koja je omogućila Hrvatima glasovanje, te odjeknula u hrvatskim diplomatskim misijama diljem Kanade. Ovo je izvanredan rezultat i pokazatelj svima u Kanadi i u domovini da kroz zajedništvo možemo doći do velikih uspjeha i rezultata. Nakon nadolazećih parlamentarnih izbora smatramo da moramo započeti raspravu o glasanju putem pošte i e-pošte, u čemu nam je Kanada savršen primjer. Stoga sve vas toplo pozivamo da se otvoreno uključite u raspravu i na vašu aktivnosti. Danas imamo jako zanimljivu i aktualnu temu. Zahvaljujemo se odazivu Gorana Šaravanje, direktora IMELUM-a za ekonomsku analizu, kako bi raspravili o ekonomskim izazovima i uspjesima nakon pridruživanja Hrvatske Europskoj Uniji. Goran je povratnik iz Australije i ima jako uspješnu karijeru u Hrvatskoj. Bio je viši ekonomist u mnogim firmama u Hrvatskoj, kao na primjer u Osijekoj investicijskoj banci, Kreditanstalt, je to tako? Kreditanstalt Investment banku i Zagrebačkoj banci i u INI. Osnivač je IMELUM-a i sada koristi svoje 20-godišnje iskustvo u javnoj politici, financijama, nafti i poslovanju za pružanje savjeta i uvida i pružanje neovisnih ekonomskih analiza o regiji jugoistočne Europe. Uvjereni smo da će vas jako dobro informirati o stanju hrvatske ekonomije nakon pristupanja Europskoj uniji i koje beneficije, a i problemi možemo očekivati nakon što Hrvatska uvede euro kao svoju nacionalnu valutu. Sada na engleskom. Greetings and welcome everyone to the 4th Crow Diaspora Talk webinar. Before we start, I would like to congratulate all the Croatians in Canada who advocated for the right to vote over the past few days. On Friday, we found out about the decision to let Croatians vote in Croatian diplomatic missions in Canada. This is a great result, and you showed everyone in Canada, in the Domovina, our homeland, that through togetherness we can advocate and get results. After these parliamentary elections, we need to begin the conversation about electronic and mail-in voting, and Canada is a perfect example of this. So get involved in the conversation and be ready after the election. Today, we have an interesting and pressing topic of discussion. I'm sure, Goran has prepared so much for us today. He has, he's been telling me that, I'm going to take out this spreadsheet and everything like that. And I'm going to tell you the exact numbers. So he's ready. He's ready for any question that you can throw at him. So I would like to thank Goran, the director of IMELUM, for economic analysis, for coming in today. He will, coming in today virtually. He will talk about Croatia's economic challenges and accomplishments since EU accession. I made a big boo-boo. I put succession on the poster. I don't mean succession, I meant accession. Goran is a returnee from Australia and has a successful career working as a senior economist for the Austrian investment bank Kreditanstalt. I think that's right. I'm not a German. Yeah, well, Goran speaks perfect German, so he can tell you.
CAIB.
Yeah, exactly. So Zagrebačka banka, and in 2012 to 2017 worked as INA's first economic advisor, chief economist. He is the founder of IMELUM, and he's putting those 20 years of exposure to policy, finance, energy, and business, as well as knowledge and insight into a fascinating region of Europe, into providing independent analysis of economic and other trends. So how we're going to kind of do this is that if you have any questions, just, ask us in the comments, and, I'll look every once in a while if the questions are like relatable to what we're talking about. Maybe Goran will actually answer your question without, me even asking them. So kind of the structure of it is that we're going to kind of go kind of general, what are our responsibilities to the EU, but then kind of get into more specifics. And I think that at the very end, we should really, I'm just personally interested about your career at INA. So we're going to definitely kind of get into that. Let's see how much we can get out of Goran. If you have any questions, leave in the comments below. The other thing that I would like to say is that without our partners at SOC, the Center for Renewal of Culture, we wouldn't be able to do these webinars, and they have helped us in many different ways. And so that's why we're asking that if you're able to do so, I know that it might be a difficult time for some people, but if you're able to do so and you really like what we're doing here at Crow Diaspora, definitely donate to SOC. SOC is doing great things. And actually, during this webinar, they're actually holding another seminar with Mato Njavro. So they have a lot of things going, and if you can, definitely donate to them. And the other thing that I would like to say is that if you really like what Goran has to say, and I'm 100% sure that you'll be very interested in everything that Goran says is backed up by his experiences, by data about anything that is happening in Croatia. He knows his shit. Let's just say it like that. He knows his shit. And so if you can, I'll put a link to his website so that you can kind of subscribe to his newsletter. And he has actually a special offer for Croatians abroad, especially the ones that are watching us on Crow Diaspora. And I'll put his email so you can email him and see what that special offer is. So I'd like to kind of get started and start our first question. Unless you have something to add, Goran, about the subscription.
Nothing to add. Like you said, just go onto the website. You'll see an email address. Get in touch with me, and I'll let you know what the details are. So perfect. Hopefully, in an hour or so, it'd be interesting enough for you to do that.
Okay, great. So I would like to start off for all of our viewers. Could you maybe outline the economic responsibilities of any member state? Maybe get into the specifics of Croatia, and what are some of the things that we need to pay, as well as what do we receive in return? Are we like a net recipient, or are we a net giver? Like Germany or France? Could you maybe kind of get into that a little bit?
Sure. So when you join the EU, you join a club. Every club has rules. This one doesn't require you to wear purple bow ties, which is good. But there are essentially, you join the EU, it's 27 member states. And the main benefit is, or there are many benefits, but one is obviously the single market. There are 4 key freedoms. So it's freedom of movement of goods, capital, labor, and services. That's the main thing. You have a market of now slightly less than 450 million people after the UK left. You have to obviously stick to Western standards of rule of law. The European Court of Justice is the court of final instance, in the sense that if you have issues that you can kick up all the way from any member state, you can go all the way to the European Court of Justice, and then they basically adjudicate on whether a process is in line with acquis communautaire, which is the set of essentially laws or standards that EU member states have to stick to. Other things that may be interesting from an economic perspective are obviously competition policy, state aid rules, which every member state has to abide by. And there is obviously then this EU level budget, which you alluded to. Now, in the 2014 to 20 multi-year, so it's a 7-year budget financial framework. So the multi-year financial framework, Croatia was going to receive 10.7 billion euros. On the other side, we pay in 1.9 billion euros. So it's quite obvious that we're a net recipient, which is logical, because as much as we have progressed, and I'll get into the details of that, since we joined the EU, clearly, like every member state of the new member states, especially in Eastern Europe, we are not at the standards where, obviously France and Germany are. And frankly, when we get to those standards, they'll be a lot further along the way, hopefully. So, but there are essentially many benefits. You're also playing political Champions League. So one of the things that we saw with Croatia acceding to the EU is a drop in political risk perceptions. One of the clearest ways, I guess, you can see is that before July 1, 2013, when the EU mentioned Western Balkans, they meant Croatia as well. Since we've joined the EU, when they mention Western Balkans, Croatia is not included in that group. So there's, that's, let's say, a change. But it's recent that we got back our investment grade credit rating. So it's been, it's been over a year now. Unlike the period before the financial crisis, when we also had an investment grade credit rating. This is now earned. This is now legitimate, as it were. You can see, since we joined the EU, let's say from the end of the second quarter of 2013 up until the end of the first quarter of this year, exports have risen almost 50%. And exports of goods, so manufacturing goods, products, they went up over 50%, and exports of services went up slightly less. And that's because you have access to a single market. The perception of risk comes down, the cost of risk comes down, the cost of finance comes down. Obviously, more potential projects move from red to black in the spreadsheet, so they become, the net present value becomes positive. We're not talking about roulette wheels here. And it's just generally reflected. The other thing is that prior to joining the European Union, we were a classic twin deficit nation. So we had deficits in the budget, so budget deficits and current account deficits. That's despite growing at an average rate of 4.5% before the financial crisis. In the 5 years to the end of 2019, we grew at 3%, but we did so with current account surpluses and budget surpluses. So that tells you that even though the average growth rate was, let's say, down by a third from 4.5 to 3, it wasn't accompanied by increasing debt. In fact, Croatia is one of the few outliers on earth, where global indebtedness has risen to record levels, but Croatia's, let's say, foreign debt came down from over 117% of GDP to slightly over 75% of GDP at the end of 2019. And public debt came down by about 11 percentage points, and private sector debt, so households and corporates, that also came down significantly. So all of that was achieved while growing, while exports are growing. And this is mainly due to joining the EU. But obviously, if Croatian society and the corporates that survived the global financial crisis weren't capable, none of that would have happened.
Yeah, well, I think that it's really interesting how you said that, like, all these financial indicators in Croatia actually went down since accession to the European Union.
The ones that you would want to go down went down, and the ones that you wanted to go up went up. Yeah,
I would say that at the very beginning, a lot of people were very skeptical. Like after EU accession, people were like, okay, Croatia's kind of stagnating with a lot of their financial indicators. But then after the recent governments, especially like in 2015, 2016, it started to come down. And, it did take Croatia a long time to come out of their recession from the 2008 crisis, but I think that it's going in a really positive direction. And you kind of alluded to a lot of, like, for example, how a lot of things became standardized and perceptions of Croatia kind of came down. And I'm kind of interested in kind of what were certain things that were standardized in workplaces, like working in. So I know that you worked in some of the biggest institutions in Croatia, like Zagrebačka banka, which is the biggest bank in Croatia, and in INA. And I was just wondering, what were some of these changes in business? What were certain things that the EU kind of said that, no, this needs to be kind of standardized for you guys to be able to do more business with the rest of the European Union? And were there any negatives of entering the European Union in terms of those aspects, in terms of standardizing certain things, or was it more of a positive than a negative?
I think when you add everything together and subtract it, it's a definite positive. Now, if you worked for a Croatian company or were the owner of a company that did well while the economy was relatively closed, and then when we joined the EU was exposed to competitive pressures and we're not ready for it, and is in the meantime disappeared, clearly you're not going to be happy. But I think it's evident that obviously EU accession. It's just the perception. I mean, let's say Fitch recently reaffirmed Croatia's investment-grade credit rating, which is no surprise whatsoever. What I found fascinating, and I put it on my blog, it's also on my website, is that they maintained a stable outlook. Now, the context of why that's fascinating is that consensus is moving to a double-digit drop in GDP this year for Croatia, and also for all our major trading partners. And that tells you, and one of the things that they said is that, you have these policy anchors because you're firmly entrenched in the West, you're in the EU, you're joining eurozone, you're planning to join, you've just met, what was that? That was on Friday the 5th that they came out. And on the 10th of June, the European Commission came out and said essentially that Croatia is the only nation outside the eurozone that meets all the conditions, except for being in the exchange rate mechanism too. We'll get into that a little bit later. So, you have policy anchors, which basically means that if you're thinking of investing here, you know that as a member of the European Union, where you need to follow acquis communautaire, local politicians or policymakers may have, out-of-the-box ideas, but there are certain things that they have to do. And that gives you certainty, or certainly reduces uncertainty. And as soon as uncertainty, I mean, in business, we're all used to uncertainty, but obviously the lower the level of uncertainty, the more likely potential investment ideas and initiatives are going to be, cash flow positive. So from that perspective, you're not really concerned, or you're not as concerned that there's going to be policy mistakes, because there is a structure which comes with joining a club, in this case, the EU, which guides you. And it's particularly important for new member states. And I would argue for Slovenia and Croatia, I think we're two specific cases, in the sense that whatever, let's say, Romania, Bulgaria, the rest of the new member states in Eastern Europe were like, they had their own countries. Whereas Croatia and Slovenia essentially didn't. We were implementing policy which was determined in the national capital of the time, in Belgrade, right? So there wasn't as much, let's say, policy formulation and implementation experience. And when we both gained independence, we had to start up central banks and ministries of finance and ministries of foreign affairs, where all the other countries already had that infrastructure. So for places like Croatia and Slovenia, joining the EU and then having to function within that club is a further step, and having that structure that comes with, again, think of it as joining a club, makes it easier for us. So this is one of the things I would say, frankly, in my experience, what was important, and I essentially, most of my career, apart from the first 1 year and 9 months, I worked in the private sector, and this was the big change, right? So private capital coming in. I think that one of the things that stuck with me was the big four accounting firms. The level of knowledge, obviously 20, 25 years ago wasn't there. But right now, after, a couple of generations of having big four accounting firms here, they are producing, CFO material, cadre which is capable, and not just capable of being, chief financial officers in companies. They are moving into, they're progressing, from, if they can't, as some of them can't, or, they get an opportunity from a client, they go and work as a CFO. And you have a lot more of, let's say, that knowledge. And that's on the basis of essentially Western capital coming in and training up people who have the requisite skills, but then they get the experience from the West. The same story with Zaba, Zagrebačka banka and INA. Private capital came into Zagrebačka banka actually in 96. So that was never in state hands. Perhaps even earlier. I may have even understated when private capital came in. Same story with INA. I mean, personally, let's be honest. If a private investor had not come into INA, they would never have created the role of chief economist. And therefore, I would never have had the chance to work there. I never would have got a look in, frankly. And those 5.5 years there, but they were fantastic. I learned an awful lot, met people who think differently to people in the financial sector. and had time to think about longer term issues. And you'll get to hear part of that through this discussion today. In terms of the EU, it's really the competition.
That affected a lot of the businesses.
Well, look, first you had the financial crisis. So anyone that was over-indebted and not efficient enough, they were cleaned out by the financial crisis. Then you had a series of, I would argue, self-inflicted wounds across all governments, because it was, I think it was the government of Jadranka Kosor that introduced crisis taxes, for example, in 08-09. We also had the late central bank governor, Željko Rohatinsky, come out and say we didn't need the IMF, which is exactly what I guess a politician would like to hear. But let's say while Romania and other member states of Eastern Europe went for IMF assistance in the financial crisis, we didn't. You think
that brought us back?
Well, it certainly did. I think it certainly did. I mean, I think that there would have been not only financing, but certainly you would have had a sounding board for policy ideas, an additional one.
Because that's what a lot of people forget when somebody comes in and they want to invest, right? It's not just their money. Everyone thinks, oh, they're giving their money and everything like that, but it's also their knowledge. And I believe in the concept of smart money, where money is not just about, you know what I mean, giving money. Money is just a means to actually do something. So definitely, like when you have an investor, you're also taking in their knowledge as well.
No, absolutely. Hopefully you're definitely learning. And you're learning, the bread and butter of businesses, how to sell, how to build long-term relationships, how to sell, how to think about basically selling, how to develop products and markets. Because bear in mind, we came out of a system where companies wasted precious capital on building, retirement, on building flats for workers and, holiday complexes, right?
Yeah.
Where, so this is, precious capital that's going into non-productive activities, right? And also a closed market. So you have to learn how to function in a competitive environment where you're exposed, you're part of an international club, part of the global economy. The world has changed, obviously. It's chalk and cheese compared to, let's say, 30 or 40 years ago. And why not learn? And why not learn from those who do it better? Better than you, certainly. And then, clearly, if you look at it statically, which is essentially what you described in your question, sure, it may turn out to be bad, but you've got to look at it dynamically. You will learn, you will see how the best do it. And then in a generation's time, you're going to have, just like the example I gave with the impact of the big four accounting firms and how they've essentially spawned, a quality cadre of CFO material in the country. Same thing in all the other areas. And this is the great benefit. And when you look at Croatian history, when did Croatia do best? It did best when, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was in Bosnia. So, for a start, you weren't on the frontier anymore. But that was the time before World War, let's say World War I, where people from elsewhere in the in the Austro-Hungarian Empire came into Croatia. And the villas you see in Zagreb, and and the fact that Zagreb was and still is an industrial center, is a vestige of that time. So I mean, you can see. I mean, and as they say, in Croatian, a man and a dog is smarter than a man alone, right? When you, that's a literal translation, but when you bounce ideas off people, I mean, when you go for coffee with someone, if you listen, you always walk out a little bit more intelligent than when you came in.
It's
apart
true.
from drinking decent coffee.
Yeah. Well,
that's the way I approach it.
Yeah, I find that it's really interesting that I think the younger generation in Zagreb, I haven't really described to a lot of our people in Croatia what I did at the student center in Zagreb. We opened up a co-working space for students, right? And actually one of our sponsors was Zagrebačka Banka. And it was really interesting that I think a lot of younger people are more agile, because that's kind of the world that we kind of live in, that you need to have that agility to say, okay, well, if this doesn't work, then I got to do this. You know what I mean? And I think that there's a kind of a generation gap between like older people, let's say an older person that has a business and has had that business for maybe 20, 30 years, maybe even like before the war in Croatia, and they're not as agile anymore. And I think that with this added competition of joining the European Union, you have this generation gap of older people that have these big companies, even production companies in Međimurje, that they're not adapting as fast as they need to in the world of business. You know what I mean? And this is how the rest of the world works.
Yep.
And I think that you really brought a really good point. But where I kind of want to bring the conversation now is, so since Croatia's accession into the EU, Croatia was stagnating after the recent 2008 economic crisis, as I said before. Mm-hmm. But since 2016, financial and economic indicators have been steadily trending upwards, you know, so or downwards in terms of unemployment. Mm-hmm. Many people credit this to the work of Croatian economist and finance minister Zdravko Marić. What are some of the things that the government has done to make stronger fiscal policy? I think you kind of mentioned this a little bit, but you can maybe elaborate a little bit more. And what has their effect been on the Croatian economy? Also, how has the EU influenced Croatia's fiscal policy decisions, and what are some examples of this?
Well, I would argue that one of the points I want to make about during this webinar is that what you're seeing in Croatia is the benefits of some sort, of continuity in policy over various governments. Mm-hmm. So let's say when we're talking about, for example, tax policy, the reduction in the top marginal tax rate began actually under Milanovic's government, when the finance minister was Boris Lalovac. Then under Orešković's government, and then the current government, this continued. So there you essentially over a span of 3 governments, you have a consistent fiscal approach, let's say, to the taxation of labor, specifically the top marginal tax rate. And I think everyone should be happy about that. That's what you'd want to be seeing. That's the sign that you're developing into, you're heading towards being a stable, and mature democracy. We have a long way to go yet, but it's encouraging to see evidence of aspects like that. When it comes to the EU and fiscal policy, one of the we have an obligation actually to join the eurozone, and to do that, you need to start bringing public debt down, and you need to bring the deficit. You have to make sure that your budget deficit doesn't exceed 3 percentage points of GDP. So quite clearly, that obligation to join the eurozone or the euro area, to adopt the euro at some point, generates its own dynamic in terms of looking at fiscal policy, seeing how quickly you can do it.
And I think that's probably one of the biggest motivators as well in the past few years, to actually switch a lot of things in our economy.
Well, it is. I mean, it is in the sense that, obviously you have a multi-speed Europe. There are, member states such as Sweden and Denmark who are not in the Eurozone. And, you have large Eastern European nations such as Poland and the Czech Republic as well, that are not, and Hungary, that are not in the Eurozone. So you have these differences, and then you have to make a calculation. How quickly do you want to join the euro? Is it in your interest? But in any event, you do have to do more to bring your fiscal house into order. I think one of the most important reforms, and I mean, I'll tell you honestly, I think I'm in business because of that reform, is that, and this is an example of how political instability can actually be, like every coin has 2 sides, right? So political instability engendered this reform that I'm about to mention. And that is that, obviously the Orešković government, when they came in together with Most, HDZ Most coalition, it was unstable. It didn't last the full term. That too was an important milestone.
It lasted a year.
It doesn't matter. It was an important milestone in the development of Croatia's democracy, because it was the first time we went to early elections. That's important because, these are all mechanisms that, early elections, governments falling, they're all mechanisms that allow democracies to function and to exhibit the flexibility which makes them so, basically, they're far more, they're certainly nowhere near as brittle as dictatorships. They're far more flexible and they're far more resilient. That's the word I was looking for. Now, what happened there was, because of the political instability or the inability to agree, all of these capital expenditure plans were unrealized. Now, another constellation of prime minister and minister of finance would have spent all that money or cut, whatever. They didn't. But we had the good fortune of having our first prime minister, who was a Canadian as well, a Canadian Croat.
Yeah, we're celebrating Croatian Canadians a lot today.
Yeah, today you are. You've got an ally in, at the other end of the Commonwealth, down in the south.
Exactly.
As you guessed today. So the point is, he has a business background.
Yeah.
And you mentioned Zdravko Marić, the Minister of Finance. He did PhD in economics and fiscal policy, but he also had a business background. And what they basically did. The fact that the money wasn't spent meant that there was, however much money was there, they used it to plug the gap in the budget. They did this before they made a decision that if your turnover at the time was less than 3 million kronor a year, so annually, you didn't have to pay VAT until you actually collected the money from invoices, which you sent out to clients. Before that decision, when you issued an invoice, you had to pay VAT instantly. So you were, crediting the government in essence. The money that was left over from not being able to agree on essentially anything in that government, that was earmarked for, let's say, capital investment or whatever else, meant that they had this pot of money which they could use to fund the gap between, obviously you're not getting the money on day one, you may be getting it on day 30, but you need the money, you need 30 days of financing, right?
Yeah, exactly.
They did that. And, people that have lived in Croatia for longer will know that they're, certainly 20 years ago and for a long time, and even now you'll talk about illiquidity or late payment. That generated a lot of liquidity for small and medium-sized enterprises in particular. Since the beginning of this year, I believe that threshold has been increased to 7.5 million kronor a year. That's roughly a million euros a year. And because of the corona crisis, it's actually all companies at the moment pay VAT once they've collected their invoices, or and I hope that reform stays. So this is one of the big ones, and this generated a lot of liquidity. Why is that important? Croatia is a small economy, a small country. It doesn't have a lot of large companies, large employers. 75% of people employed in this country, myself included, work for SMEs.
Yeah.
Right. And that's, and, when you basically provide such support for, private sector liquidity, you don't need to be surprised that you have some sort of, you essentially have moderate, yes, it's moderate growth, but it's still, and it compounds with all of the, all of those macroeconomic imbalances I mentioned at the start became macroeconomic surpluses, i.e. the macroeconomic risk came down on top of the risk perception that came down from joining the EU, right?
Yeah, so, it's definitely a motivator for the Croatian economy, especially, trying to get into the eurozone and actually having some sort of long-term goals.
Yep.
Me personally, I don't know if you would agree on this, but there's a lot of people, with my experience with a lot of business owners, is that they don't really think of the long-term sort of ideology, going like, okay, well, what am I going to do in 4 years from now? You know what I mean? How is my business going to look in 5 years? People don't, it's kind of weird. A lot of people don't have that sort of ideology of, okay, how are we going to do business in 5 years? Where do I see myself in 5 years? A lot of people kind of think of maybe just the fiscal year, and albeit that's probably an ideology also here in Canada in certain businesses, but because it's an SME sort of environment, I think that also plays into, where do I want to see myself in 5 years? Where do I want to see myself in 10 years? And also they're kind of saying to themselves, where am I going to get this financing? So I think it was definitely a motivator to the Croatian government. And I think it's a motivator being part of the European Union in terms of an economic standpoint, because there's actual goals. There's actually like, okay, let's get to this goal. Even if it takes us so many years, it's a long-term goal and you can actually do something. And I think it's a really great example to a lot of business owners in Croatia that being part of the European Union, you should have long-term goals. So it's kind of maybe like not to use maybe a liberal term, but it's kind of like trickle down in a way, right? Where it's like whatever is at the top, maybe it'll have an effect at the bottom, like towards some of the businesses. So I kind of want to ask specifically about the 4 criteria that so the convergence criteria to enter the eurozone, And also we have actually a question from one of our viewers about this. But I was just wondering, could you maybe talk about each one of the convergent criteria? So for example, price stability, the sound and sustainable public finances, exchange rate stability, and long-term interest rate stability. So according to HGK and other government institutions in Croatia, they say that we're going to be probably implementing the euro in 2023. So my questions are, have we met all the convergence criteria, so the specific ones? And then also during the implementation process, including what has been going on since joining the EU, as you mentioned that, you know, it's an obligation for Croatia to join.
Not just Croatia.
Well, not just Croatia, but anybody, right? Any EU state. What should we expect to see in the next 3 years? So if we're going to be implementing it in 2023, and are there possible consequences in joining the euro? And I think I have a specific question for you about that. And what are some of the benefits and some of the challenges of joining the eurozone? You mentioned some of this as well, but maybe kind of elaborate a little bit.
Well, first of all, let me go back to your question about Croatian businesses. Now, you know, when I worked for Zagrebačka banka, I wasn't a banker and I wasn't dealing with, you know, day-to-day with businesses. But certainly, you know, when I look at the roundtables that I took part in, where, you know, especially foreign investors would be taking part, the consistent, let's say, criticism of domestic businesses, they're not ambitious enough. They make their money, they're doing well, and they're happy with that. That's what, you know, let's say foreign investors with whom I've taken part on roundtable discussions and various forums or fora have consistently said over the years. And, you know, but I think that, you know, certainly opening up the economy, being part of the single market, seeing others make the most, you know, was it listing in New York or planning to, you know, for example?
Yes, I believe it's InfoBeep,
Yeah. Well, I mean, you know, that type, you know, that's, you know, there's a challenge for anyone else, you know.
It's a challenge, but also...
Well, no, for bragging rights, you know. Well, you know, they've done it, so why can't you? And other people, you know, when you have a good example, you know, it can generate a momentum of its own, right?
Well, I think that that's great. Like one of the examples with InfoBeep is that they've become such a big company, right? Like even their headquarters, unfortunately, aren't in Croatia anymore because we don't have that double tax treaty between Croatia and the United States. So they went to London. But besides that, I think that it's really interesting that you can have a big company in Croatia. You can open an IPO, so an initial public offering in New York to get bigger financing because, you know, when you become a big company in Croatia, you know, there's only so many financing options that you have until you need to say, okay, well, we need to maybe do a public offering. And maybe
it's not just Croatia, it's in the eurozone. And let's see if I can answer that as part of these questions that you asked. So listen,
exactly.
On the 10th of June, the European Commission, they issued a status report on, you know, readiness, you know, progress on joining the euro area. And essentially, Croatia was the only country whose legislation is fully aligned with the requirements of the euro area. And we meet all of the conditions, except that we're not in the exchange rate mechanism too. Yeah. Now, what the exchange rate mechanism is, the member states of the euro area and Denmark, which is in the exchange rate mechanism, they sit down with Croatia and they will determine the central parity, so the euro kuna exchange rate. And that can vary up to 15%, right? But I expect that the band will be much narrower, which the Croatian National Bank and the government will agree with the Eurogroup, you know. And then for 2 years, you have to maintain exchange rate stability. So whatever band you determine, and as I said, I'm convinced that it's going to be small, then the exchange rate's not allowed to move outside of that band. If there's sustained pressure, especially on appreciation of the domestic currency, as was the case with, let's say, Slovakia before they joined, then they may have to revalue, i.e., you know, they have to change the central parity and enter the eurozone at a stronger exchange rate. But I'm not sure that given what's happening in the world, I'm not sure that that's going to be an issue that Croatia will face. But anyway, that's ERM2. You have to be in there for at least 2 years. I'm expecting a decision during the course of this year that Croatia, that the central parity is defined, the fluctuation band, and the date of entry into ERM2. From that date, 2 years from then, it doesn't matter when in 2020 we join ERM2. I believe that then on the 1st of January 2023 is a feasible date for actual accession into the eurozone. Now, my view, and I suspect also if there are any of my fellow macroeconomists, chief economists of banks listening, and theirs as well, is that I would argue that Croatia is uniquely placed to essentially seamlessly join the eurozone. Now, the argument is as follows. Yugoslavia allowed people to save in German marks in 1965. What that basically meant was, listen, the economy's gone, we need foreign currency. And, they didn't say it for obvious reasons, but it was an admission that, essentially the post-World War II wonder was over. It wasn't functioning. You need to save. You can save in foreign currency. So for 55 years, people here and a little bit further east and south and west even, up until 2007 in Slovenia, were saving in German marks and then euros once the euro came into effect. Why did they do that? And as a hedge, as protection against inflation, for which Yugoslavia was known, as protection against currency depreciation and devaluation in one case, right? So we've been doing that anyway. And the other important thing to bear in mind is essentially since 1965, we've outsourced monetary policy to Frankfurt. It's the way that monetary policy works in Croatia, and that's the only way it can work, given that something like, at one point, 80% of savings was in euros, right, or foreign currency. The Croatian National Bank isn't going to target domestic interest rates. They're going to have to target the exchange rate because all the money supply is all in, in euros, or before that in German marks, right? So the transmission mechanism, because you can aim for one or the other, but not for both at the same time, right? So that's why they always, look at the exchange rate vis-a-vis the euro, before that the German mark. And obviously, because you have to import, if your exchange rate, every economy imports and exports, if your exchange rate depreciates too quickly, then there's always a risk of imported inflation. The cost of goods from abroad goes up. It's then reflected in the rate of change of prices in the domestic economy, which can if it goes too far, clearly can generate its own adverse issues. Especially if you borrow in foreign currency, because let's be honest, banks, if the savings are in euros, they have to match their foreign exchange, not just the term, right, as much as possible, but the exchange rate. They're not allowed, because of the way that central banks function. They're not allowed to have too much of a mismatch in their foreign currency positions. So quite clearly, they're going to only at some point, and certainly in the start, only offer loans from mortgages, for household loans, which stretch out to 30 years, with an exchange rate clause. Now, if you let that exchange rate depreciate or devalue, then you've basically risk wiping out the middle class, and that essentially, is something that happened to a large extent, let's say in Serbia in 2008, when their currency went from 79 to the dinars to the euro to 100 in the space of 90 days at the end, between, let's say, the end of September 08 and the 1st of January 09. Now you're earning local currency, and all of a sudden your FX loan, your housing loan, your car loan, whatever loan you've taken out, you've got to pay, let's say, in this case, it was what, 25% more local currency out to meet the loan payment. Obviously, you're going to have a lot less disposable income. So,
and as you mentioned, as you mentioned yesterday, you said that for even Croatian loans now, like when you look into, let's say if you want to get a mortgage in Croatia, if you actually get a loan in euros, it's way cheaper. Like you explained it to me that there's actually more euros in circulation than kunas in circulation. So it's even cheaper for you to get loans, and that could even that'll be one of the benefits of the Croatian economy, where you can take out a loan and the interest rate is not going to be as high as if you would try to take out a loan in kunas?
Well, I mean, the reason is, let's say if you take out a loan in kuna, straight kuna, there's no exchange rate risk. But there is, even though there's plenty of kunas in the system right now and interest rates are low. So the exchange rate, the only risk is on the interest rate, right? When you take out a loan linked to euros, you have some exchange rate risk. Every month, it's a different exchange rate. It moves a little bit, right? And so to compensate for the fact that you actually have exchange rate risk, then on top of the fact that there are many, many more euros out in circulation, the interest rate will be lower. While we had Swiss franc loans, because the exchange rate risk was much, much higher, the interest rate was lower as well, in an attempt to reflect the risk reward, you know, if you like, yeah. Now, so that was the reason there. But clearly, though, given that we spent 55 years as a nation saving in German marks first and then in euros as protection against inflation and, you know, current depreciation of the local currency, it makes absolute sense to join the euro. And you will certainly see, what you will see is a reduction in business costs, because, you know, at that point, when you join the eurozone, you don't have to convert kuna into euro. There'll be a lot more transparency in terms of pricing of financial products, because again, you'll have a much clearer benchmark, much more liquidity. It'll just be the country risk premium that will come in. There won't be any exchange rate, you know, aspects which increase the cost of transactions and therefore of business. We've seen in all the countries that joined the eurozone that you had a pickup in lending. Now, it also depends on when, you know, you join. When Slovenia joined in 2007, in a way, it proved to be exactly the wrong time, because in 2008 you had the financial crisis, right? But they had the party of all parties in terms of credit growth because of that impact in 2007, and that generated a lot of macroeconomic imbalances. And in the end, a couple of state-owned banks ended up costing the taxpayer 5 billion euros to save. But in any event, there are, you know, so they're the benefits. They're clear benefits, the economic benefits. There. Politically, I think there are massive benefits as well, because, you know, you're joining the core of the European Union. So once you move from outside the eurozone into the eurozone, then you're basically sitting at the same table as everyone who's bringing every decision in, because decisions made in the eurozone also impact the countries outside the eurozone.
Well, I think here's a good question to kind of maybe counter all the positive stuff. Sorry to be doom and gloom.
That's why I left it.
So basically, we have a question from one of our viewers by Brian Gallagher. And thank you, by the way, for always posting our webinars in your on your website, the Croatian Business Report. As a part of EU membership, Croatia is committed to join the euro, but without a deadline for doing so. So the kuna is already deeply tied to the euro, as we mentioned. But is it the wise thing to do to join in the near future, given the various cracks in the EU? Not least there was the recent German Constitutional Court decision regarding the European Central Bank, and I believe that was because they were lending out bonds or something like that. They were issuing bonds in a very, I believe it's something like that. It had something to do about bonds, right?
Yeah, they essentially asked the European Central Bank to consider proportionality and everything, take a wider view. It was widely criticized, that decision, and Brian is right to bring up the issue. These things need to be discussed. I would also add another risk. So that's definitely something we need to talk about. Another risk is, and I actually have it, one of the first blog posts on my website mentions it. I think it's something about, when the big boys in the schoolyards fight, essentially when the 8th graders have a fight, all the 1st graders stay away so they're not hit by flying chairs or whatever else, right? So it was basically an allusion to differences of opinion between, let's say, Germany and Italy on, Eurozone and how that may affect the whole process. The other thing is that, as we saw in the financial crisis and all the way out in 2012, there is always the risk that you may be forced into essentially austerity when the economy least needs it.
Exactly. I want to mention that.
These are, these are, risks that are out there. But we also have examples of countries like Slovenia, which are small enough and essentially didn't have as many macroeconomic imbalances despite being in the eurozone. So the question is, how can we be in, if a situation like that comes up, we're small enough already, which is an advantage in this case. And essentially you don't want to be noticed, and you want to be constructive enough to be able to avoid that situation. Now, to refer directly back to Brian's question, in a situation where, let's say, the fate of the eurozone is in question, whether you are in or out, you're going to have a problem economically, right? I would argue that with the local currency, we're having to convert into euros, and basically, essentially, like you've seen this year, the central bank, they spent 2.2 billion euros defending the currency, right? And it was only when they agreed a swap line with the European Central Bank on the 15th of April that things started to calm down, right? 2 billion euro swap line. You're going to have problems anyway if a tectonic shift such as the eurozone falling apart were to happen. You're going to be in trouble because you're in Europe, it's your biggest trading partner. Your monetary policy, as I explained earlier, is linked to the euro. There's no way out for you anyway. I would argue, though, that this is something that would be extremely expensive, primarily to Germany, because 50% of their growth is based on exports. And for them to continue exporting the way they do, they need a healthy eurozone, because most of their trade is with the eurozone. So who do they export to if Italy and Spain and France run into massive problems and there's no demand there? And the other thing is that countries such as Germany and the Netherlands, if the eurozone were to fall apart, or if they were to leave the eurozone of their own volition, they'd see their currencies appreciate. Now, we can speculate by how much, but it's certainly double digit in percentage point terms. And essentially, they've in that event, at that moment, essentially, they will have gone against their own essentially macroeconomic policy of maintaining export competitiveness, which Germany did by holding down wage growth through the Hartz IV reforms under the Schröder government in 2003-04. So they will have basically backtracked on, essentially 20 years of macroeconomic policy aimed at boosting export growth. And that at a time when there's no demand from China, or a lot less, question marks over US demand, question marks over, how domestic demand, whether and how quickly it'll recover in the eurozone. So, net exporters, big net exporters such as Germany, such as South Korea and Taiwan are singularly exposed to risk right now in the global economy, because there's not as much demand out there for them. So this is another aspect that needs to be taken into account. And then on the 18th of May, it's not as if German policymakers and key politicians are not aware of these risks. They came to an agreement with France on the recovery fund, 500 billion euros. So this is a joint fiscal policy. It is one-off. It's the second time it's happened. 1974 was the first time in response to the first oil price shock. So there's an awareness there, and certainly German business is keenly aware that if the eurozone isn't healthy, if key member states of the eurozone are not healthy, if there's no demand there, then there's clearly going to be a knock-on impact on German, Dutch, and other Northern European member state export performance.
The next question that I want to get to is, so as we know that one of the fundamental parts of being part of the European Union is the freedom of movement. So you can go live in any country within, the European Union, within the Schengen area specifically. And, a lot of people, I think, in Croatia use this advantage to, kind of live in other countries like in Germany, Austria, and so forth. It was a problem before joining the European Union that there was, that emigration from Croatia. And, you know, we're proof of that, you know what I mean? Like, we're both in the diaspora.
I was about to say that,
yeah, we're both proof of that. But also at the same time, I think that joining the EU kind of exacerbated the problem, you know? So unfortunately, high unemployment, you know, specifically after joining the European Union in 2013, it kind of helped. We were kind of intending that it will make like a stronger and more robust economy. But then actually, unfortunately, high unemployment and the ability to freely live and work in another country has caused the opposite effect. Problems such as brain drain and labor shortages are exacerbated. What are some policies that could help Croatia retain their people and possibly attract them to come back to Croatia? Because when we were talking before, I remember that you were saying specifically that, you know, for example, right after Croatia joined the European Union, maybe a lot of the financial, you know, indicators were kind of stagnant. But then when the next government came in, they started working towards the eurozone. So it's not specifically a European Union problem, but maybe it's a policy problem of the individual country, in this case, Croatia. What are some of the policies that maybe Croatia can implement to maybe help alleviate the, you know, the huge burden of not having enough employees and actually bringing in employees and maybe bringing some of these people back to Croatia?
Well, I mean, this is an issue for the whole of Eastern Europe. It's not Croatia specific. And it's one where it's generating. So, you know, when you talk about Eurozone, there's always talk of North and South. So Mediterranean Europe is not competitive in this and that. But you also have East-West issues where, you know, Croatian taxpayers, Bulgarian taxpayers, Romanian taxpayers, Hungarian taxpayers have spent, you know, hundreds of thousands, if not over €1 million per person, right? Over 20 years of formal education, you know, technical colleges, universities, whatever, generating human capital that essentially goes for free into the West.
Exactly.
So this is not just a Croatia issue. This is an issue of the entire Eastern, all of Eastern Europe, right? And it's one where clearly there's scope for Croatian policymakers and politicians to build coalitions with member states with similar and even worse, in the case of the Baltics, you know, demographic trends and immigration trends, looking for compensation or looking for, let's say, when you're talking about, let's say, joining the Eurozone and meeting these criteria, say, well, listen, you've had all these benefits as well. So give us a little bit of slack over this and that. So this is a debate that is live in the European Union. It's one where we have plenty of allies, and where I think we have clearly solid arguments to seek some redress through the various mechanisms that the European Union has. There is actually a fund called the European Youth Initiative, which is one of the structural funds that the European Union, where it helps out member states such as those in Eastern Europe. Listen, what can you do? Overnight radical decisions aren't going to be good. Don't do stupid stuff. Mm-hmm. So one of the things, so this, look, joining the euro is going to, I already said, reduce transaction costs, reduce uncertainty further, provide more transparency in, excuse me, in the pricing of finance and financial products. The other one that we need to mention is Schengen, and specifically in the context of Italy. Now, why do I mention Italy? Italy is our main trading partner. Italy is the reason that Slovenia has always been wealthier than Croatia, in the sense that between Austria and Italy, you'll find Slovenia along the way. Clearly, when Italian, let's say, I'll stick to Italy, just for simplicity's sake, not that it doesn't apply to Austria as well. When Italian manufacturers are looking how to optimize their production process, they'll look at Slovenia because it's nearby. Because if they send intermediate goods across the border, there's no waiting time, there's no customs. It's seamless. Now, consider that in the Croatian context, when we joined Schengen, again, you will not have trucks waiting on the border with Slovenia or Hungary. So that's seamless. What does that mean for Istria, for example. Now, Istria, you might not know this, but by Croatian standards, Istria is underpopulated. There's less population in Istria per square kilometer than there is in the whole of Croatia. Right? Mm-hmm. What does it mean? What opportunities will it provide for regions such as Gorski Kotar and Lika, which are struggling? Because, I mean, you know, if you go to Istra, you may as well locate in Gorski Kotar or Lika. Who cares? We've got fantastic motorways. We're working on the infrastructure with EU funds on rail. What does it mean all the way along the Slovenian border, you know, for Zagreb further north and that, you know, and this can again generate its own dynamic. So something like Schengen as well. And so Schengen and the Euro are two, let's say, one-off productivity gains, you know, where because you have this one-off improvement in the business environment or in the cost of doing business coming down, you have a permanent improvement in the attractiveness of Croatia. So make sure that, as you mentioned right at the start of this webinar, make sure you meet your long-term goals and don't do anything stupid such as kill the second pillar of pension reform. That's superannuation to all the Australians listening. You know, where, you know, 5 percentage points of the pension payments that we make, you know, the surcharge, go into private individual accounts for everyone who has been working, who was younger than 40 and employed since 2002. So basically everyone. There's over 100 billion kuna worth of assets under management at the moment. And crucially here, if you'll have a look, and I've got all the links, anyone who's interested, I'll send you the links. Just send me an email.
I'll put the email in the comments.
Yeah, put the email there. I'll send the links on what the European Commission said last week in terms of Euro readiness for Eurozone. Even more important is they do a debt sustainability an assessment every year. And you'll see on this massive document, 300 pages, on pages 82 to 84, they have this S2 indicator of, let's say, long-term sustainability of fiscal policy. And you might not believe this, and I certainly had to read it 3 times. What I did is, but Croatia apparently doesn't have a long-term fiscal sustainability gap because of pension reform. Because, you know, very, very shortly, you are going to start to get people who are going to be paid out much more. They're going to get pension, basically co-payments, if you like, or a surcharge through the money that they've saved since 2002. And this will alleviate the problems, you know, of the sustainability of the pension system going forward. So, you know, unlike Poland, unlike Hungary in 2008, who, you know, Poland through a constitutional law, Poland through a decision of its own, they abolished these second pillars. I'm not sure that they would if they had the chance. Again, Romania and Croatia do have these second pillars. Slovenia doesn't, even though it's wealthy enough. But they don't because they've always had a pensioners party in government. So that stopped basically essentially current pensioners stopped any attempt to, you know, essentially mandate employees to save for themselves in the future. But this is a major source of, let's say, long-term fiscal stability and sustainability if we maintain the system. And that is crucial over the next decade or so. And after that, it'll be okay.
So we only have, well, it's over an hour now, but what I was thinking of doing is that maybe we can just do one more question, then maybe you can go a little bit into, you know, your personal experiences in INA.
Okay.
And then we can kind of conclude it. And because I find it really interesting though, is like, I think a lot of people now are specifically talking about since the coronavirus in Croatia has been like a detriment to the tourism industry, that we need to diversify our economy. And so I'm just wondering, is there, in what like sectors of the economy that we can probably diversify, that we can maybe encourage a little bit more, and then kind of maybe move away from such a big part of tourism? Because according to the OECD, you know, anything above, I think 1.5% of your GDP being produced in tourism, like that, it's not healthy and it's not sustainable. So how can we kind of move away from tourism, and maybe we can like go into different and diversify our economy so that other sectors of our economy are stronger, so that when something like the coronavirus ever happens again, or any, like, you know, tourism is a very fragile sector, you know what I mean? Like we could even see that even after the Bataclan attacks in Paris, you know what I mean? The Paris attacks, where over 100 and something people died. People didn't want to go to Paris anymore. You know, for a whole year, it was like, don't go to Paris because it's dangerous. So something as small as that, well, it was a huge event and it's a horrible event, but something like that can happen anywhere, you know, and anybody that wants to inflict harm, or there's something like the coronavirus or something very small where people don't have access amount of money even, you know, they don't have that, like the money, the finances to actually go to Croatia or to go somewhere, you know, that's pretty much every economic crisis that happens every, whatever, 10 years. How can we diversify and make sure that our economy is more robust in the future?
Well, I would say that our economy is more robust today, certainly than when I turned up here 21 years ago. And you could see it as well with contrast, let's say, the approach of the central bank, the Croatian National Bank, during this crisis and in 2008, where they were scared to death of the currency depreciating, right? And now they've actually let it go a little bit. They've even done something like buy government bonds on the secondary market, which risks further depreciation. But, you know, clearly the economy's developed. When you look at, let's say, the share of manufacturing in GDP or in value added, it's 15%. It's not that little. You add in, let's say, electricity production and then mining and quarrying, which is essentially HEP and INA, and it's 20% of GDP. That's not small. That's not small. It's one of the bigger shares of, let's say, the broader definition of industrial production in GDP. Yeah, tourism is important, but it's important for places like Austria as well. And as you already mentioned, France and the whole of Mediterranean Europe. And we have the advantage of being an automobile destination. People can drive here. Not exactly the case with Greece. I mean, you can. It just costs more, takes more time. So more people have to fly. So I would argue that places like Greece and arguably Portugal are even more exposed, and Spain to an extent. But, you know, the whole of Europe is impacted by the effect of coronavirus and the recession on tourism. Specific policies, I'm not sure whether, I certainly wouldn't have the confidence to pick an industry and say that's going to be a winner. I would.
Let's say, for example, like the IT industry in Croatia, like that we mentioned a little bit earlier, InfoBip, right? I think that really that could be the future of Croatia, where you could be anywhere in the world, you know, and we can advertise Croatia as not, for example, I was talking to my friend, he actually works at Apple, and he said that, you know, a lot of people think, okay, let's like outsource our IT part or our back end of our office to India or something like that. And India will do it for really cheap. But Croatia, for example, we can really advertise it as being something, you know what I mean? It's quality over quantity, you know?
No, there's definitely that case there. Listen, when it comes to, you mentioned IT. Now, you know, the central bank actually now has data on services, exports and imports. And it looks like I clicked the wrong spreadsheet, but it doesn't matter. We'll have the data for the full 2019. Exports of essentially IT will be, let's say, the low end, 800 million euros. And, you know, high end, which may happen, not likely, but could be up to €1 billion this year. Tourism exports at 10.5 billion, but, you know, essentially in 2013, IT was about 300 million. So you're seeing a strong progression there. That's obviously a sector. When you look at, let's say, I mentioned earlier that Zagreb was it still is an industrial center. It was more so earlier. But I mean, you know, I think sectors like health, especially in terms of health tourism or, you know, European retirees, pharmaceuticals, definitely metals, engineering, agriculture, potentially logistics, certainly. These are all areas that there would be some sort of, let's say, potential, and I'm sure there's a whole lot more that people who are actually prepared to risk money, entrepreneurs, are going to discover. So what you'd really need to do, and I think is focus on the efficiency of the public sector at all levels. Because let's say for the same amount of tax kuna and in 2023 tax euros that we pay, if we could have 30% better service, which is to say 30% more certainty that decisions will be made on time, be consistent.
Exactly.
All the bread and butter stuff. That's like depreciating by 30% to improve your competitiveness.
Yep.
Can we get more consistent decisions? Can we get them, can we get them repeated for the same thing? Do I get the same service at all levels? Local government, county, national level. Can we have decisions made 30% more quickly? Complex ones where you need to take time. Can we, this is where the focus has to be. I think there's obviously now with an election campaign, a lot of talk about cutting this and cutting that. That's all fine, but I just don't see how easy it is. It's clearly difficult because any reform that was simple would already have been, or would already have happened if it were really simple. It's not. Right.
Yeah.
You can spend a lot of political capital, get nowhere. But if you have that focus on, on efficiency, you consider, let's say, rather than just in the first order impact of, let's say, we can save X billion kuna by doing whatever. Think about the second and third order issues. How do you make sure, for example, that you have quality judges in Istrian villages or in Lika? How do you keep a judge, let's say in Gospić doing what he's doing? How do you ensure that the court in Makarska, also, let's say, for example, if you look at the Dalmatian hinterland, how quickly do they make decisions for, cases up there, let's say commercial decisions or whatever? They're likely to do it on the coast because there's more money, it's tourism related, whatever else. Do we get consistency of approach? Make the public sector more efficient. This is what we need to have a discussion about this, and we need to look at ways and look at the second and third order issues to see how we can, really dig deep and see what we can do. Because when you have more certainty, when you are, when you've got to go out there and get permits, that you will get them on time, that you can plan your investment. Clearly corruptions or perceptions of corruption is another issue. Legal system as well, decisions, can they be made more, again, can they be consistent, handed down so consistently and in an acceptable time frame? Because you can't wait for a year or two if you've got an investment waiting.
Exactly.
But people need to understand that we're all part of a team, and judges and public sector servants and public servants and we're all on the same side. And there needs to be and this is what, just very, very quickly, I know we've got time pressure. This is one of the, let's say, unintended positive consequences of the coronavirus story in Croatia, is that people saw that there are public servants that definitely know what they're doing. They work very hard, and it makes sense to pay taxes, right? Now, the other thing you saw is, unlike 0809, no increase in taxes. There was a concerted effort made to help the private sector, not because we love them, but that is the tax base. You kill the private sector, you haven't got any tax revenues. No tax revenues. You might be employed in the public sector, but you're not going to get a salary, or you're certainly not going to get, the pay rise you think you deserve if there are no tax revenues. Now, all the way through this, despite the massive hit to government revenues, pensions on time, subsidies to the private sector, public sector employees paid on time. So there is this awareness, and you saw that the opposition, unions, even the church, they all worked in unison with the government, accepted certain things. So this was quite positive, actually. So we need, and also the digitalization of certain services. We just need to make sure, we need, you mentioned that Croatian Canadians or Canadians of Croatian extraction need to get involved. Here, we need to make sure that we can sort of hold on to the reforms that essentially the virus forced upon the government, so that they're in place after the virus, after we learn to live with the virus.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, because there's a lot of things that even during the virus, for example, like the propusnica or whatever to go. Yep. Now there's like a propusnica. So if you want to like go somewhere, then you can actually just do it online. You know what I mean? There were so many things that were like, okay, well, we can't have these people going into MOOC or something like that to just fill out a piece of paper when they can do everything online. And I think that that's definitely going to be a factor, is digitalization of a lot of our things that we do. And I think that this also comes into effect. We talked about this a little bit on the last webinar, is that there's like a whole movement now where there's that Glas Poduzetnika in Croatia, and they're starting to realize that there's certain things that are inefficient in Croatia, and we should implement more efficiencies, because, as you said, these people are paying taxes, they're paying for the public sector, and the public sector, it needs to kind of think of it more or less like, okay, like for example, I worked at HGK, and at HGK I would always say, like, to people that if you want people to perceive HGK as a good place that you're actually doing something, then you gotta first of all market what you're doing, that it's doing well. And the second thing is that you gotta offer things that people actually need and actually want, and then the only way that you're going to do that, in my personal opinion, and I said this multiple times, and I was very controversial at HGK, is that I said remove the članarina, like remove the membership fee of HGK, and then you'll actually have this kind of capitalistic approach where you put your products on the market, and if people want to pay for it, they'll pay the članarina. You know what I mean? If you offer something good, then they're going to pay for it. That's my little spiel.
I mean, I personally would be happy if we didn't use the word uhljeb, I mean, I know exactly. There are always, look, in Australia, we say bludgers. There are bludgers, everywhere, people that they don't pull their weight, right? But, I really think, there needs to be an awareness who pays the taxes. It's commercial activity, whether it's a state-owned enterprise, in commercial activity, the whole private sector, no one else. This story that you work for the public sector and you pay taxes. No, you don't. The government, certainly in an accounting sense, says, okay, that amount, your brutto dva, that's what they collect from you and me. And then they say, okay, you get netto, and the brutto dva goes on this side, right? It doesn't mean that you are paying tax as a public servant. And this is something that, let's say in Australia, when I worked there in the New South Wales Treasury, we were very, very aware of, right?
This is actually one of the questions that Don Markušić actually asked. Right. He said, what you have found to be the difference in analyzing the Croatian economy that is still in transition, and what we're analyzing the Australian economy when you work there. So this is perfect. So now you get to answer it.
Yeah, that was, I mean, clearly, different histories and whatever else, and and a clean start from the British Empire helped. Much more commercial approach. The public sector is, fantastic. It's more independent and has deeper roots and much more knowledge, which, again, to come back to the story of the EU, is why it's so important we joined, because you're hanging around the wealthiest and the smartest of the EU. You're learning. They're getting in touch with you. You're getting in touch with them. You're figuring out on every single issue that the EU comes up, every single directive that the public service, so that's the European Commission, dreams up. People are getting in touch with Croatia to figure out what our views are. You're trying to figure out, what first you define your goal, and then you figure out who else has a similar situation, who's on your side, who's against, and you learn all the way through. And you're already seeing the benefits of that. But yeah, that's the big difference. But I mean, I think to an extent, you saw that here. There wasn't that backlash like you had in 08, 09. We've got it. These guys are making money. They need to pull us out. We need a crisis tax. We need to increase VAT. All that sort of stuff. That sort of, pushed us into a longer recession that we needed to have. Now it was a completely different approach. And again, on my latest blog post, I said that's learning from past mistakes is one of the benefits of the coronavirus. The policy response was far more, I would argue, logical. And I hope that as a result of it, people realize, both in the public sector and in the private sector, that essentially, you can't have one without the other. Because if you need a permit, you need it on time, first time, as soon as possible. Not come back and forth 3 or 4 times, and I don't know, help me out, and then, scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, or even just the perception of it. No one has to even be corrupt. Is that the perception of it is enough to tell someone, forget it, we'll go somewhere else.
And you know, I think that this topic has been coming up multiple times even in our past webinars. You know what I mean? So from our first webinar, when we're talking about how the economy is going to look after the coronavirus in Croatia, but also from Don Markušic's webinar about the law in Croatia, where, for example, if you go to the court, right, and let's say the whole process, the court process, you know, by the time you see the judge and then the multiple times that you see the judge, it's not in a consecutive period. It's not like day after day after day. You go to the court and you get a decision done maybe in a week or 2 weeks or even a month, you know what I mean? Every single day going to the court.
Yep.
In Croatia, there's a bunch of these things where it's like it's spread out over a long period of time. It's a weird paradox in Croatia where we don't have like these long-term plans in terms of business, but then at the same time, it's like we have a long-term plan in going to, you know, doing bureaucratic things every single day. So it's interesting how for bureaucracy, we're willing to, you know, go the full extent and go multiple days at a time, or like go for months and months at a time without seeing a judge, then going and not going and everything like that. And you know, by the time the judge actually makes a decision, you know, he might have even forgot about why the heck they're all there for, you know what I mean?
Yeah. And in the meantime, you've borrowed money that's been sitting on the sidelines waiting for him to make a decision.
Exactly.
And so we need to, you know, this needs to be teased out, and essentially you need to motivate, you know, especially I think the courts are a specific case and an area of where, you know, ideally I'd like to see the progress we've seen elsewhere in the public sector, you know, occur there as well. In terms of the economy post-coronavirus, look, this is going to be much, much worse than 08-09 in my opinion, and globally so. The San Francisco Fed, they came out with an excellent piece of analysis. There's a link to it, or, you know, there's on the article on the early June blog post I have. It says that after a pandemic, you know, you basically have forced savings and less investment and slower GDP growth. Clearly, you know, when you look at the OECD's forecasts, and my clients know what I'm thinking about Croatia, you know, it's, you know, this is going to be a deep, deep recession, worse than 08-09, in my opinion, not just for Croatia, but the whole of Europe, you know, globally as well. China won't be able to help anywhere near as much as they did in 09. The risk, I see two risks for Croatia. First is how to maintain human capital here. And the second one is there's a lot of SMEs here, as I said. That's a risk factor. Not that many large companies. How do they survive? And how do they stay in the European and global supply chains that they've managed to join since we've joined the EU? So they need to maintain customers. First of all, they need to stay solvent. Then they need to somehow maintain their workforce. Then they've got to maintain their customers and their position in the supply chain. The discussion about reshoring is interesting, in the sense that this just-in-time MBA business has proven to be extremely fragile in terms of supply chains. So there's talk of, you know, you've seen that in terms of PPE equipment and pharmaceuticals, certain products, we're more reliant on China than what we realized. And so there's talk of reshoring bits and pieces of that into the European Union. Obviously helps that Croatia's in the EU. Obviously it helps that we've got human capital and knowledge in the pharmaceutical industry, for example. There are others as well. So this is an opportunity for Croatia. That's a positive, but certainly the biggest risks are maintaining human capital in Croatia, labor force, and how do all these SMEs survive this brutal recession that we're going through? And I believe that most people aren't even aware of it, you know, to the full extent of it. We'll know in September, or, you know, even in August, once all this assistance from the government rolls off. So these are the challenges. And, you know, considering all of that, I mean, join the eurozone as soon as possible. Financial markets expected, investors expected. They're hoping for it. It would be a positive. There are risks, but I think that the risk of staying out, given how febrile the global environment is, given the fact that, you know, there was that talk of the eurozone potentially falling apart. I mean, in that case, we're all underwater. It's a massive shift. So, you know, you may as well be in the Eurozone. Your banks get access to capital. The ECB is buying government bonds. They're bringing down the spread. You've got easy access to finance. People are less worried about where you're going and that policy anchor story. So there.
Yeah.
So let's round it out like that.
So unfortunately, I don't think we're going to have enough time to kind of get into INA and stuff like that. And I think that we need to kind of conclude it there. But really interesting. And you know, as I said at the very beginning of this webinar, is that I really respect Goran's, you know, whole perspective. As you can see, when, you know, whenever he talks with so much. He's basically the encyclopedia about the Croatian economy. You can ask him any question, and literally, like, all you need to do is just find Goran in Zagreb, buy him a beer, and he'll tell you everything. You know, he'll give you the rundown better than
just send an email. But yeah, subscribe first.
Subscribe first, then buy him a beer when you're in Zagreb, and then you're able to, you know, it'll be great. And really, yeah. Goran, I'm really glad that you know came on today and really answered a lot of these questions. We didn't get to all the questions, but you know, as any, you know, even with our last webinar, you know, we had like tax questions, and with any questions, you can't just, especially when you're talking about the economy, when you're talking about taxes, when you're talking about anything financial, there's no simple question. You can't just ask, what's this? And then you're going to get a simple answer. It's always, there's a lot of different perspectives that and different variables that have to be considered when you're talking and answering any one of these questions.
Oh, well, so that's why my tagline is your source of context in Southeast Europe, precisely. So, you know.
Well, I think you proved that today.
Well, thanks very much. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk.
No, it was an honor. And thank you so much. And, you know, definitely subscribe to his emailing list, as well as email him personally, because I think you have a really great deal, and he'll tell you when you email him. And the other thing is that if you're able to give the tzok to the Center of Renewal of Culture, also do that. So I would like to end it here, and thank you, Goran, once again. And yeah, so signing off.
Yep, sure. Bye.
Okay, see ya.